Alhamdulillah, we're all fasting, and may Allah accept the fasters who fasted on the 17th, on the 18th. I don't know if anybody fasts on the 19th. I don't think so. But I think there was apparently some kind of debate because of when they saw Sha'ban. In any case, لِكُلِّ بَلَدٍ رُؤْيَا, Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, every city has its sighting. But I just thought that was a really powerful reflection because we don't really think about how these technologies have completely affected our lives, and not just our lives, but our relationship with our religion and with our Lord. And that's why it's just good to disconnect from time to time. So this month, how many people are in the book club? No readers. They say readers are leaders. The Prophet said, "Iqra warqa," read and rise. So just if you look at the most powerful nations on the earth, just material power, not looking at spiritual power or anything, although there is some relationship sometimes. So, number one, most people would say, U.S., yeah. So, most of the books, right, over 30% of all the books produced in the world are produced here in this country. In terms of writing, research development, all these things. And then the next one is China. And the next one's European Union. There's a direct correlation between literacy and between people's places in the world. And that's why literacy is one of the most important things that the Prophet ﷺ brought. And it's his miracle that he was unlettered, and yet he said that to learn was incumbent on every Muslim man and woman, according to the Hadith, Idrajan, in Ibn Majah, and others. So reading is really important, but this month we're reading this book, Weighing the Word, and this book is really an extraordinary book, and there's copies outside. I didn't know there was going to be copies outside, so didn't come to plug it like that. But in any case, this book is, obviously every book is going to have its problems. There's no book except the Book of Allah that is free of problems. But I literally finished this book and started it again. And I do that very rarely. But I literally finished it and started it again immediately. That's how amazing it was for me. So this book is a book. He has as the front piece the verse of the Qur'an, "Inna sanulqi alayka qawlan thaqila." We are going to thrust upon you a weighty word, qawlan thaqilan. And so he says, weighing the word, because it's a heavy word. And so reasoning the Qur'an as revelation is the subtitle. The argument in the book is that one would think if one out of close to every 4 people, we don't really know because census is very difficult to get a global census, but there are at least 20% of the world's population has some level of adherence to Islam. Now, the vast majority of those people are not that educated, and many of them not educated at all. Nonetheless, they come from long lines of passing this religion on since the early period when it spread extraordinarily fast around the globe. And so he gives several arguments of why this book should be considered revelation, but I wanted to read the opening and in hopes that people will read this. I'm hoping to get the author on this. So he begins the book here The most important, indeed most obvious question that may be asked regarding the Qur'an is that addressing its ostensibly revelatory character. Is it revelation or not? Simply put, is it the Word of God as it claims to be or not? For the Islamic community, taken in the fullness of its course and span, the answer has seemed perfectly, indeed blindingly self-evident. So if you ask a Muslim, of course, it's the Word of Allah. If you ask them why they believe that, I think a lot of Muslims would be hard-pressed to really give any kind of sophisticated answers to that question, because most of them have inherited the religion. And that's why I think this book is an extremely important book, especially for English readers, because you should have arguments and understand why this book has been considered to be revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he actually comes with, I think, some original insights in it. For the Islamic community taken in the fullness of its course and span, the answer has been a perfectly self-evident one. For those in the West, whether past or present, whether Christian or secular modern, the answer has, until quite recently, also seemed perfectly self-evident. What Dr. Cleary said, Western people can't think about thinking about Islam. That's how bad it is. They can't think about thinking about Islam. They just dismiss it, very glibly also. Just, that ridiculous religion. Who would follow that religion? And if you look at Gary Wills, who did something for the Amir Stein, I actually read his book, which was an amazing book called What the Qur'an Says and Why It Matters. He is a scholar of religion, PhD, Yale, I think, or Princeton. I think he's Yale. And after 9/11, all these people turned to him. And they said, well, gee, Gary, you're a scholar of religion. What does the Qur'an say? Is this something the Qur'an would say? Like kill people and blow up towers and things like that? And he said he was ashamed that he'd never read the Qur'an, because Americans can't think about thinking about Islam. So he actually went and spent over a year just studying the Qur'an. And he ended up writing that book. And he was shocked at what he found. And it's an amazing book, and it's a testimony to, even if you don't end up converting to Islam, you will come out with an immense respect, at least, for the tradition itself. When 9/11 happened, we went, Shaykh came to my house, and because I didn't have a TV, and he said, something bad's really happened, and we went to his house and watched the news. And I remember that day, and it'd be good to find this clip. The writer, Tom Clancy, he's a kind of writes CIA novels and things. He was being interviewed, and somebody said to him, do you think Muslims did this? And he said, absolutely not. He said, how can you be so sure? He said, because it's suicide and murder. And both of those are prohibited by the Qur'an. It's a good answer. So quite generally, the matter of the acceptance or rejection of a claimed revelation frequently and naturally polarizes between those within a given faith community who naturally and dispositionally accept the ostensible revelation and those outside of it, particularly those of a rival faith community. Because Islam has not been in rivalry with Judaism. It's only very recent that there's been these problems between. This is very recent, 100 years. Prior to that, the Muslims were the protectors of the Jews. And the Jews, there weren't always the best of times, but they were certainly far better than their experience in Europe. And anybody can read Bernard Lewis's book, Islam and the Jews, and he has quotes, one of the quotes from a rabbi from Germany telling all the Jews, because he migrated to Turkey. And he said, come to Turkey, migrate to Turkey, because here the Jews are treated fairly. Everything is good here. They don't have the anti-Jewish sentiment that you find in Germany. Like he was telling him, come and, Musha bin Mamun, the great Maimonides, wrote in Arabic, right? Dr. Ali's here, right? You've read him in Arabic, right? Yeah, Judeo-Arabic. He wrote with a Hebrew script, but in Arabic. He was an advisor to the Sultan, the Ayyubid Sultan. He was a private physician for Salahuddin. There were Jewish ministers in Andalusia. Shabrut, he was a minister in the Umayyad. There was Jewish ministers in Iraq. Right? The Muslims didn't treat the Jews the way, and that's why, shame on the community. Especially, these rabbis that speak ill of Islam and tell the Christians all these things. Why are you doing that? Because they know. I haven't met a rabbi that doesn't know about Islam. I have never met a rabbi that doesn't know about Islam. And they know. And many of them have told me that, in fact, we had one rabbi, he said, you were with me. I think Freydun was with me. He said, no, I believe. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu Muhammad Rasulullah. And that was the opinion of Rabbi Fayumi and some of the great. They considered the prophet a prophet, but he said he wasn't a prophet for us. He was a prophet for the Gentiles, teaching Noahidic laws. That's what they said. But the real struggle has been with the Christians. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he said, الفرس لا أخشى عليكم. I'm not worried about Persia. أو كما قال. He said it's mursal hadith, but still they're all thiqat. And time has proven the soundness of this hadith. He said, I'm not worried about Persia. لها نطحتون ونطحتان قادسيا نواهن. These are the two great battles. And then it's over. He said, لهم نطحة أو نطحتان. They'll have two butts, like a goat's butt. Two thrusts. And then la faris. Then he said, there's no Persia after that, meaning they're not a threat to you anymore because they become Muslim. And he was like in Rome, but Rome. And Rome is Europe. Anybody that studies the history of Rome knows Rome is Europe. Rome, that's al-Qurun. Multi-generational Rome. كلما هلك قرن ظهر أو برز قرن آخر. He said, أصحاب صخر وبحر, possessors of the sea and of the land. Heyhata, heyhata. وإنما حركته مع الساعة. There's a riwayah, they will end in the last hour. There's another riwayah, the Prophet ﷺ said, أصحابكم ما دام في العيش خير. You should have good relations with them as long as things are good. As long as you're in good relation with them, things are good. In other words, if you're fighting them, it's hell. And there's hadiths of the ghazwa towards the latter days, and then the malham al-kubra, all these things. In any case, that's the rival faith community, whether religious or secular, who in turn naturally in dispositions reject the claimed revelation. Historical experience teaches that those inside and outside of such a faith community are rarely unpersuaded from their respectively normative views, just as they are rarely persuasive to one another. And that's very true. I had a friend who said to me, the problem with debates, it's like the football game. When the Seahawks beat the Patriots, is that who won? Seahawks. When the Seahawks beat the Patriots, I think one of my boys cried when the 49ers lost. But when the Seahawks beat the Patriots, all the Patriots fans didn't suddenly become Seahawk fans. They said, we'll get them next time, right? And that's what the way these Christian-Muslim debates are. We'll get them next time. And a lot of it is ego. I really showed him. Did you see that? It just becomes an exercise in ego. And that's why جادلهم بالتي هي أحسن. The Qur'an says, debate in the best way, the most beautiful way. And the most beautiful way is مقام الحال أبلغ من مقام The maqam of your hal is abragh min maqam al-maqal. It's more powerful. It's the state, it's the quality of the Muslims that spread Islam more than any other factor. It was the quality of the Muslims, this is the way they behaved. That's what spread Islam in so many places. It was who they were. The Prophet ﷺ, people saw him like the Bedouin who just saw him and believed. All of these observations are particularly true with respect to the normative judgments regarding the Qur'an to be found in Islam and the West. In one respect, relatively little has shifted in outlook in the nearly 13 centuries since the earliest Christian polemic against Islam. So the earliest one is probably St. John of Damascus. And you'll find all the same tropes in that. It's not that long, but you'll find all the same attitudes that he put in that treatise. You'll find they're still replicated. As Richard Fletcher has sagely observed in this regard, attitudes laid down like rocks long ago continue to shape the moral environment for many centuries thereafter. There is a geology of human relationships which it is unwise to neglect. Nevertheless, the rise of secular modernity has certainly complicated the orientation of the West with regard to the question of the Qur'an. There has also been more recently a reevaluation, if not a rapprochement, within Christianity itself. In this latter regard, three touchstones of particular note may be mentioned. First, the pontifical declaration Nostra Aetate on the relation of the church to non-Christian religions of Pope Paul VI. Second, the many positive statements and interactions of Pope John Paul II with respect to Islam and Muslims over the course of his pontificate. Third, and most recently, the Common Word initiative, launched initially as an open letter signed by a large representative body of Muslim scholars and religious authorities addressing Christian leaders worldwide. I was one of the editors on that letter, and unfortunately they didn't take my edit, which was, I wanted between you and us, or between us. They put between us and you. So they went with the Arabic. Because in English you always, yeah. They wanted to keep the Arabic, which has grown to become the most significant and successful platform for Muslim-Christian interreligious dialogue in history. In any weighing of judgment with regard to acclaimed revelation such as the Qur'an, it is never the case that disinterested, reasoned argument, disinterested here means objective, is the sole consideration. Rather, factors related to identity, will, and sentiment also contribute. Sound arguments may be given, but none will be persuasive to all individuals. For a faith community, the putting forth of such arguments is nevertheless necessary for three reasons, perhaps for three reasons. This is a very important point he's making. To comfort the faithful. In other words, to help the faithful understand that what you believe is, there's strong and powerful and cogent reasons for why you believe in what you believe. That this is truth, haqqun min rabbikum, this is a truth from your Lord. And so you want to strengthen the iman, especially these young people, because it can be very bewildering for young people today when they look at the Muslim countries, they see all the failed states, they see the state of the Muslims, it becomes really difficult for them, like, anahnu ala al-haqq. I mean, even the Sahaba, when they, at Hudaybiyah, they didn't understand the wisdom in the compromise. So that's the first one. And then to possibly persuade the neutral, because you're going to have people that are neutral. And so perhaps those people you can persuade, and they are. Islam is a very powerful and persuasive religion. And Joram Cleverer is a very good example, the Dutch politician who was an anti-Muslim. He was actively working against Islam, but because he had a sincere heart and because he wanted to study Islam in order to refute Islam, but he ended up, because he was a fair person, he actually studied Islam from what Islam says about, and he ended up becoming Muslim, and now he's written books about Islam. So that's a good example of persuading people. And he wasn't neutral. He was like, it's like an Omar conversion story, because he was actively working against Muslims. Finally, to not necessarily cede argumentative ground to those in opposition. This is a really important point. If you let them narrate your story, it's going to look very bad. I mean, I saw a rabbi give a talk about Mamdani saying that his Marxism is completely inspired by the Qur'an. He said Muslims don't believe in private property. This had 35,000 views in one day. He said Muslims don't believe in private property. The Qur'an says God owns everything and the state can just take away your property. That's what he said. And people will believe that. So you're ceding ground if you don't respond. And that's how Raddu Shubuhat is an obligation, to actually refute the obfuscations, refute the shubuhat, the doubtful things that people put in their minds. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said in the Hadith, يَحْمِلُ هَذَا الْعِلْمِ مِنْ كُلِّ خَلَفٍ عُدُولُهُ يَنْفُونَ عَنْهُ تَحْرِيفَ الْغَالِينَ وَانْتِحَالَ الْمُبْطِلِينَ وَتَأْوِيلَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. He gave us the three roles of those who carry knowledge in every generation. The first is that you refute the extremists. وَانْتِحَالَ الْمُبْطِلِينَ. It's such a beautiful, the Prophet is the most eloquent of the Arabs, no doubt, and the most eloquent of humanity. But intihal, yantahilu, is to take things out of context. Intihal is to take something out of context. You're taking a part of it. So it's the decontextualization of the mubtilin, the people who want to nullify the religion. They want to take things out of context, like saying God owns all property. I mean, that's true, but it doesn't mean that we don't believe in private property. So it's using something, it's decontextualizing it to lead people astray. Intihal al-mubtilin wa ta'wil al-jahilin. So the deviations of the extremists, the decontextualizations of the nullifiers, and the interpretations of the ignorant. That's the role of scholars, that they need to guide the people. So the impartial consideration of such arguments may well also be considered a necessary exercise for those opposed, if for nothing else as a potential corrective to possible misunderstandings or misjudgments. This aside, however, one may also simply try to approach the question as dispassionately as possible, however imperfectly this may be achieved. And in view of that consideration, may be brought to bear, evaluate what judgment, however personal and tentative, may be made. So that's also important, not to use reason and not to use emotion. Blood is no argument. Blood's not an argument. You kill somebody, you didn't kill the argument. And shouting somebody down, not listening, not engaging. And there's so much anger, there's just so much rage out there. And the world will give you plenty of reasons to get angry, but it'll also, the Prophet ﷺ, if you look at his sunnah, he did not get, he saw people tortured, his own people being tortured. And he advised them to be patient. And that hadith, Imam Ahmad relates that hadith. There's no indication that he was saying, he was speaking to the ones being tortured, not to the torturer, because he knew there was no benefit. So the Prophet ﷺ he didn't get angry. There's one instance in the haram where he said something very strong. And the Prophet ﷺ said, I'm a human being, I get upset. But he never allowed his anger to وَالْكَاظِمِينَ الْغَيْظَ وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ وَلَا يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. كَاظِمِينَ الْغَيْظَ. Those who swallow kazama, they swallow their anger. They're in control of themselves. And that's why anger is important, ghadab is important, but it's in, as they say in the books of akhlaq, to the right degree, for the right reasons, and at the right object. Because a lot of people they're angry and they're just walking around angry for reasons they don't even know why. and then you just become an excuse for them to express their anger. Like, quote unquote, trigger somebody. So the present monograph, which is aligned most closely with this final dispassionate mode of engagement, is an exercise in what might be termed exploratory apologetics. It is an attempt, no doubt particular and incomplete, to discover, sort through, and posit what considerations and arguments may be brought to bear in respect of the Qur'an's revelatory status. Many of the considerations presented are well known, at least by those who take an interest in such matters, while some are quite recent, even cutting edge, and a few, to our knowledge, original, either in conception or application to the question at hand. Our aim in this is at once comprehensive and modest. We have not included every possible argument. Some will no doubt have escaped our attention. Others we have considered weak or problematic. Still others are of note and value, but of detailed technical nature beyond the scope of a presentation such as this. For a certain type of Muslim reader challenged in faith by the worldview of secular modernity, the considerations presented may well be found to serve as a help and support. For a non-Muslim reader, whether secular, Christian, Jew, or other, these same considerations may well demonstrate the question of the Qur'an's revelatory status is at very least to be regarded as a serious one. At this point, a mild suggestion may be in order. Ideally, the present monograph should have never been written nor needed to have been written, as the material it covers should have been addressed well before and by more able individuals. By way of contrast, Western Christianity, both Catholic and Protestant, has developed an apologetical tradition for the rational defense of its faith. This is, with a handful of noteworthy exceptions, largely not the case with contemporary Islam. As Shabir Akhtar has observed, unlike their Christian rivals, Muslims have not produced a philosophical defense of rationality of Islamic theism in the modern world. I mean, there are some changes in this. One of the Shaykh Hamza Karamali is a good example of somebody who's trying to give rational defense for people, and he's teaching people to do that. Somebody who took the Aqeedah very seriously and studied ilm al-kalam. And there's others, Hamza Tortsisis, I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name, but there are others who've been involved in that, of attempting to present rational arguments. But Christianity has developed continuous and distinguished philosophical and apologetic traditions. I mean, Alvin Plantinga is a really good example of somebody who's even taken seriously by seculars. Another one is a book that we read in the book club by Stephen Meyer, The Return of the God Hypothesis, which is a really excellent book. And it would be really good to see a Muslim version of that, because he's obviously, although a Muslim could benefit from that book. But he shows how the fine-tuning problem is getting so impossible to believe that it could have been random. Because originally they had just a few numbers that needed to be finely tuned. Now it's over 200. And each tuner has to have like millions of possibilities, and it has to be exactly where it is. And each one of them has to be perfectly tuned for the universe to even come into existence. But but we have failed to really produce a solid apologetic tradition, especially in the West, because a lot of the attacks on Islam are coming from the West. And now you're seeing these, what they call ex-Muslims, these people, most of them had some kind of trauma or something. I mean, they all have these horrible stories that they tell that have nothing to do with Islam, but more to do with just culture or behavior. And some of them are just flat out grifters, making money. And then some of them are also not even from a normative Islam, they're from sects within Islam, and then so they weren't even really considered Muslim by Muslims. They were from heretical groups. But some of them, they get jobs and can make careers out of it. You can make a career out of hating on Muslims as a former Muslim. No ideas. Good luck on the day of judgment, that's for sure. Our foremost concern in the present work has not been for the Qur'an per se, so much as for the Qur'an as a particular instance and evidence of the reality of the transcendent. So here's a really important point. What he's saying is that the whole idea of transcendence is under threat. We're living in a time where just God and the concept of a creator and the fact that we should be obedient to that creator, these ideas are being challenged and have been for a long time, and in some ways, and he makes this argument, that it's more than that they've been challenged. That this is the normative perspective of the world for most academics, most historians, and most scientists. We would also suggest that in the contemporary context, readers of other faith traditions may also have a vested, if possible, conflicted interest in the Qur'an as conceivably revelatory, because it might create a conflict. There was a very brilliant Christian theologian at one of the Catholic universities and she wrote a really interesting book, but she was asked to teach an introductory course on Islam, which many professors in a religious studies department might be asked to do, even though they have no expertise in it. So she had to learn and study Islam in order to teach the course, and because she's a very fair-minded and open-minded person, she actually took it very seriously. She ended up having, even though she's a devout Catholic, she had a kind of crisis of faith because she felt that the evidence for the Prophet ﷺ being a prophet was very compelling. And this is why the Jews have known. They've always understood that the Prophet, if he wasn't a prophet, and some of their medieval scholastics believed he was, but if he wasn't, they recognized him as a providential force, like that he was from God. And that's simply a fact. So he says the Qur'an has at the very least the appearance of a major eruption of the transcendent into the human domain. In other words, whatever happened in the 7th century in Arabia that bursts upon the world in this amazing explosion of civilization and literacy and mathematics and devotion, whatever that was, it was very powerful. So whether people believe it's a revelation or not, it certainly has some kind of hallmark of the transcendent coming into the immanent. So these are terms that are used in religious studies of, our tradition calls it the muta'aliyat, right? Allah is al-muta'ali, Allah is transcendent. So ta'ala Allah, Allah ta'ala, right? Ta'ala Allah, Allah the transcendent. So the transcendent is not in this immanent realm. This is the huduri realm. He's not in this immanent realm. In any physical way. He's with us in knowledge. Allah sees and hears. But the idea that it's a material phenomenon, we completely reject that. And that's why Islam is, I think, the strongest of all the religions in just absolutely asserting the utter transcendence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. كُلُّ مَا خَطَرَ بِبَالِكَ اللَّهُ خِلَافُ ذَلِكَ. All these things that we learn. And then he ends this opening with, in this regard, the words of Pope Pius XI have a certain pertinence. How consoling it is for me to know that all over the world, millions of people 5 times a day bow down before God. So that's a Catholic Pope acknowledging that this is something amazing. And there's a consolation that it means that God is still worshipped, even though so many of the Europeans have turned their back on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.